The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of courtroom 7B, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Judge Michael Stevens adjusted his black robe and settled into his high-backed leather chair, preparing for another routine day of traffic violations and minor offenses. At 58 years old, with graying temples and stern blue eyes, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades on the bench. "Next case," he called out, his voice echoing through the quiet courtroom. His clerk shuffled some papers and announced, "The State versus Gloria Washington, Your Honor. Traffic violation, specifically exceeding the speed limit in a school zone." Gloria Washington walked forward to the defendant's podium. She was a well-dressed black woman in her mid-50s, wearing a navy blue business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Her hair was neatly styled, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. But Judge Stevens barely glanced at her, his eyes fixed on the citation in front of him. "Mrs. Washington," he began, his tone already carrying the hint of impatience, "you were caught driving 35 miles per hour in a 20-mile-per-hour school zone at 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Gloria began, her voice steady and respectful, "I acknowledge that I was speeding, but I would like to explain the circumstances if I may." Judge Stevens let out a small sigh that was audible throughout the courtroom. Earlier that morning, he had been lenient with 3 other speeders, all of whom happened to be white. But something about this case made him feel less inclined toward mercy, though he wasn't conscious of his bias. "Mrs. Washington, a school zone violation is a serious matter. There were children present at that time," he said sternly, cutting off her explanation before it began. Gloria tried again. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand that completely. I'm actually a school administrator myself, and I was rushing tow." "Being a school administrator should make you even more aware of the dangers of speeding in a school zone," Judge Stevens interrupted, his voice growing harder. The few people sitting in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the unusual tension. The court officer, who had worked with Judge Stevens for years, noticed something different in his demeanor. Normally, the judge would at least hear out a defendant's explanation, especially for a first offense. But today, he seemed determined to make an example of Mrs. Washington. "Given the seriousness of this violation," Judge Stevens continued, "I'm imposing a fine of $500 plus court costs. This is non-negotiable." He emphasized the last words, already reaching for his gavel. Gloria's shoulders stiffened slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of my offense, but this morning I was actually rushing to help with a student emergency at—" The sharp crack of the gavel cut through her words. "Mrs. Washington, the fine stands. Pay it within 30 days or face additional penalties. Next case." Judge Stevens called out, already looking past her to the next file. As Gloria turned to leave, she caught the sympathetic eye of the court clerk, who had witnessed many similar scenes play out in this courtroom. The clerk handed her the paperwork with an apologetic smile, whispering, "You can set up a payment plan at the window outside if needed." Walking out of the courtroom, Gloria's face remained composed, but her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the citation into her briefcase. She had dealt with similar treatment throughout her life, but never stopped stinging. Little did Judge Stevens know that in just a few hours, their paths would cross again under very different circumstances. Back in the courtroom, Judge Stevens had already moved on to the next case, showing noticeably more patience with a young white man who had run a red light. He had no idea that his actions that morning would soon force him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and his role in perpetuating systemic biases. As the morning session continued, the weight of the heavy fine he'd imposed on Gloria Washington was already fading from his mind. He couldn't have imagined that this routine traffic case would become a turning point in his life, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and his sense of justice. Later that evening, Judge Michael Stevens' home buzzed with excitement. Blue and silver balloons decorated the entrance, celebrating his daughter Emma's high school graduation. The judge had changed out of his court robes into a casual blue sweater and cakes, trying to leave the day's cases behind him. "Dad, when is Aunt Gloria coming?" Emma asked, adjusting her graduation cap for photos. She promised to bring her famous chocolate cake. The 18-year-old bounced with excitement, her long brown hair swaying as she moved. Sarah, the judge's wife, checked her phone. She texted she's running a bit late. said she had an unexpected situation at the courthouse this morning. Sarah was arranging food on their dining room table, humming softly to herself. Judge Stevens barely heard them, busy mixing punch in the kitchen. The doorbell rang, and Emma rushed to answer it. Aunt Gloria! Her happy scream echoed through the house. The judge smiled, hearing his daughter's joy. Gloria Washington had been Emma's godmother since birth. She was Sarah's best friend from college, and over 20 years, she had become like family. He walked toward the entrance, punch glass in hand, ready to greet her. But the glass nearly slipped from his fingers when he saw her. There, hugging his daughter, was the same woman he had harshly fined that morning. Gloria was wearing a different outfit now, a beautiful purple dress instead of the navy suit, but there was no mistaking her face. Gloria looked up, meeting his eyes. The warm smile she usually gave him wasn't there. Instead, her expression held a mixture of hurt and disappointment that made his stomach twist into knots. Michael, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of their morning encounter. Sarah, noticing the strange tension, looked between them. Is everything okay? Emma stepped back, her celebration mood dimming as she sensed something was wrong. Aunt Gloria? Dad? Judge Stevens stood frozen, memories from that morning flooding back. How he had cut her off. How he hadn't really looked at her. How different his tone had been with her compared to other defendants. Shame crept up his neck, turning his face red. I didn't realize, he stammered, something he never did in his courtroom. No, you didn't, Gloria replied softly. She turned to Sarah and Emma, managing a smile. I brought the cake I promised. She held up a box, trying to maintain normalcy for Emma's sake. Sarah, knowing her best friend's expressions after 20 years, realized something was seriously wrong. Emma, honey, why don't you help me get the cake set up in the kitchen? Emma looked reluctant to leave, but she followed her mother, leaving Judge Stevens and Gloria alone in the entrance hall. Gloria, he began, but she raised her hand. Michael, I've known you for 20 years, she said, her voice steady but sad. I've watched Emma grow up. I was there when Sarah lost her mother. You've eaten at my table countless times. Yet today, in your courtroom, you couldn't even see me. The judge felt each word like a physical blow. He remembered his impatience, his harshness, his refusal to let her explain. Would he have acted the same if she had been white? The question hit him hard. The fine isn't the issue, Gloria continued, placing her purse on the side table with careful movements. It's that you treated me like a stranger. Worse than a stranger. You treated me like someone who didn't deserve basic respect. From the kitchen, they could hear Emma laughing at something Sarah said, the sound emphasizing how much Gloria was part of their family life. I didn't. I never meant. Judge Stevens struggled to find words. He who was always so eloquent in court. I know you didn't mean to, Gloria said. That's part of the problem. You didn't even realize what you were doing. How many other people have stood before you, Michael? How many other times have you made assumptions without even knowing you were making them? The celebration sounds from the kitchen seemed far away now. Judge Stevens stood in his own entrance hall, feeling like a defendant himself, facing questions he had no good answers for. This evening, meant for celebration, had turned into a moment of painful self-discovery. Behind them, Emma called out, Dad, Aunt Gloria, were ready to cut the cake. They looked at each other, knowing they had to put on happy faces for Emma's special day. But nothing would be the same after this evening. The comfortable walls of Judge Stevens' worldview had begun to crack, and through those cracks, an uncomfortable truth was seeping in. The graduation party continued, but the joy felt forced. Judge Stevens sat in his favorite armchair, watching as guests moved around his living room. His eyes kept drifting to Gloria, who was sitting with Emma on the couch, looking through graduation photos on Emma's phone. Emma noticed something was wrong. She had known her father and godmother her entire life, and their usual warm relationship had turned cold. Every time her father looked at Aunt Gloria, guilt flashed across his face. Every time Gloria caught his eye, she quickly looked away. Mom, Emma whispered, pulling Sarah aside near the kitchen. What's going on with Dad and Aunt Gloria? They're acting weird. Sarah sighed, watching her husband and best friend avoid each other. I'm not sure, honey. Something happened at the courthouse this morning. Emma's eyes widened. The courthouse. Was Aunt Gloria in trouble? Before Sarah could answer, Judge Stevens stood up and walked to his home office, closing the door behind him. Through the window, guests could see him pacing, running his hands through his gray hair. Inside his office, he pulled out the day's court records. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, reviewing his decisions. The truth was there in black and white. $250 fine for James Smith, white male, speeding. $200 for Mary Thompson, white female, running a stop sign. Then $500 for Gloria Washington, speeding in a school zone. Michael. Sarah's voice made him jump. She stood in the doorway, concern written on her face. What really happened this morning? He looked at his wife of 25 years, shame making his voice rough. I was unfair to Gloria in court. I didn't recognize her. I treated her differently than the other cases. Differently how? Sarah asked, though her expression showed she already understood. I was harsh, wouldn't let her explain, gave her a bigger fine than anyone else today. He sat heavily in his office chair. Sarah, I've known Gloria for 20 years. How did I not see her? Because you weren't looking. Gloria's quiet voice came from the doorway. She had followed Sarah, Emma standing anxiously behind her. Emma stepped into the office, her graduation cap still perched on her head. Dad, how could you not recognize Aunt Gloria? She's been in my life forever. The judge looked at his daughter, seeing the disappointment in her young face. I was just following protocol. He started, but Emma cut him off. Protocol? Emma's voice rose. Dad, Aunt Gloria taught me how to ride a bike. She made soup for us when Mom was sick last year. She helped me with my college applications. Emma, Gloria said gently, your father didn't see me as your godmother this morning. He saw me as just another black defendant in his courtroom. The words hung heavy in the air. Emma looked between her father and godmother, understanding dawning on her face. Dad, is that true? Judge Stevens wanted to deny it, but the evidence was right there on his desk, the different fines, the different treatments, the assumptions he had made without even realizing he was making them. I didn't mean to, he began. That's the problem, isn't it? Emma said, surprising everyone with her insight. You didn't mean to, but you did it anyway. How many other people's godmothers have you treated that way, Dad? The question hit him like a physical blow. How many indeed? How many times had he made snap judgments based on nothing but appearance? How many times had he convinced himself he was being fair while showing unconscious bias? Outside the office, they could hear the party continuing. Someone laughed loudly. Music played softly in the background. But in this room, a family faced an uncomfortable truth that would change them forever. I need to make this right, Judge Stevens finally said, looking at Gloria. I need to do better. Gloria nodded slowly. Yes, you do. Not just for me, Michael. For every person who stands in your courtroom. Emma moved to stand between her father and godmother, taking both their hands. We'll help you, Dad, but you have to really want to change. Judge Stevens looked at his daughter, then at Gloria, then at his wife. In their faces, he saw both judgment and hope, disappointment and love. He realized that this wasn't just about one fine or one morning in court. This was about seeing the truth about himself and deciding what kind of man, what kind of judge, he truly wanted to be. After most of the graduation party guests had left, Gloria found Judge Stevens sitting alone on the back porch. The evening air was cool, and fairy lights twinkled in the garden that Sarah had planted years ago. Inside, they could hear Emma and her mother cleaning up, their voices muffled through the glass door. May I join you? Gloria asked, her voice firm but not unkind. Judge Stevens nodded, gesturing to the empty chair beside him. For a long moment, they sat in silence, watching lightning bugs dance in the darkening garden. 20 years, Michael, Gloria finally said, her hands folded in her lap. For 20 years, I've been in your home. I've celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and Thanksgivings with your family. I held Emma when she was just hours old. The judge gripped his armrests tightly. Gloria, I am so sorry about this morning. If I had recognized you. That's exactly the problem, Gloria interrupted, turning to face him. You shouldn't have needed to recognize me to treat me with basic respect. Would you have cut off a white woman the same way? Would you have refused to let her explain her situation? Judge Stevens opened his mouth to defend himself, then closed it. The truth was uncomfortable, but he couldn't deny it. "Let me tell you what really happened this morning," Gloria continued. "I was rushing to school because one of my students, a young black boy named Marcus, had a severe asthma attack. His inhaler was in my office because his family can't afford two of them, one for home and one for school. I was bringing him his medication." The judge felt sick to his stomach. He hadn't even let her explain. "But you didn't want to hear that, did you?" Gloria's voice was steady, but carried years of pain. "You saw a black woman in your courtroom and made immediate assumptions. Do you know how many times I've experienced that in my life, Michael, even from people who know me?" Inside, they could hear Emma laughing at something Sarah said. The sound made both of them think about how they'd watched her grow up together. "I've been to parent-teacher conferences where white teachers assumed I wasn't Emma's godmother because we don't look alike," Gloria shared. "I've been followed in stores while shopping for Christmas presents for your family. I've had to teach my own children how to behave if they're ever stopped by police, just to stay alive." Judge Stevens felt tears forming in his eyes. "I never knew." "Because you never had to know," Gloria replied. "That's what privilege is, Michael. It's not having to think about these things. It's being able to go through life without these daily struggles." She pulled out her phone and showed him a photo of young Marcus, the boy from that morning. "He's 13. His mom works 2 jobs. When he had that asthma attack, she couldn't leave work to bring his inhaler because she might lose her job. These are the stories you don't hear in your courtroom when you're too quick to judge." The judge stared at the photo of the young boy, thinking about how his quick judgment could have had serious consequences. "I don't expect you to solve all these problems," Gloria said more gently. "But I do expect you, as my friend and as a judge, to start seeing them, to start listening, to understand that justice isn't just about following rules, it's about understanding people's circumstances." From inside, Emma called out, "Dad, Aunt Gloria, we saved some cake for you." "We'll be right there, honey," Gloria called back, then turned to Judge Stevens. "Michael, I'm not here to shame you. I'm here because I care about you and your family. But if our friendship means anything, you need to do better. Not just with me, but with everyone who stands before you in that courtroom." Judge Stevens wiped his eyes and nodded. "I will do better, Gloria, I promise. But I need your help to understand, to really understand." Gloria stood up, offering him her hand. "That's a start, Michael. That's a start." As they walked back inside to join Emma and Sarah, both knew that this conversation was just the beginning. The comfortable walls of their old relationship had crumbled, but perhaps something stronger could be built in its place, something based on truth, understanding, and real justice. The Monday after Emma's graduation party, Judge Stevens sat in his chambers staring at a large stack of case files. He hadn't slept well all weekend, Gloria's words echoing in his mind. Now, he was doing something he'd never done before, reviewing his past 6 months of decisions. His hands trembled as he made 2 lists on a legal pad. One column showed sentences and fines for white defendants. The other showed those for defendants of color. The pattern was clear, and it made him feel sick. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called out, quickly trying to organize the messy pile of files. Judge Diana Robinson, one of his few black colleagues on the bench, stepped into his office. She was in her 60s, with elegant gray hair and kind eyes that held years of wisdom. "Michael, are you okay?" she asked, noticing the unusual disorder in his normally tidy office. "You missed our morning briefing." He looked at his watch, shocked to see it was already 10:30 a.m. "Diana, I need your help." His voice cracked slightly. Judge Robinson sat down, her expression concerned. She had known Michael Stevens for 15 years, but had never seen him this disturbed. "I've been unfair," he admitted, pushing the legal pad toward her. "I've been reviewing my cases, and the evidence is right here. I've been harder on people of color, giving them higher fines, less chances to explain, fewer breaks." Diana picked up the pad, studying his notes. Her face showed no surprise, which made him feel even worse. "You knew?" he asked quietly. She put down the pad and looked at him directly. "Michael, many of us have noticed these patterns in various courtrooms, but it's different when a judge recognizes it in himself." "How do you handle it?" he asked. "Sitting up there, making decisions that affect people's lives. I remember that every person in my courtroom is someone's child, someone's parent, Someone's friend, she replied. Just like your friend Gloria. Judge Stevens looked up sharply. You know about that? Diana smiled gently. Small courthouse, Michael. Word gets around. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because I saw you pulling old case files, and I thought you might need someone to talk to. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration. I've been on this bench for 20 years, Diana. How many lives have I affected without even realizing my bias? How many people have I judged unfairly? The real question is, Diana leaned forward, what are you going to do about it now? Judge Stevens stood up and walked to his window, looking down at the courthouse steps below. People were coming and going, their lives about to be affected by decisions made in these rooms. I need to change, he said firmly, but I don't know how to start. Diana joined him at the window. Start by listening, really listening. When someone stands before you, see them as a person first, not just a case number. Like I should have seen Gloria, he whispered. Exactly. She touched his arm gently. Michael, recognizing the problem is the first step. Many judges never get even this far. He turned to face her. Will you help me? I need to understand how to be better, how to be truly fair. Of course, she nodded. But it won't be easy. You'll have to question everything you thought you knew about justice. Judge Stevens looked at his calendar. He had a full docket that afternoon, 12 cases waiting for his decisions. For the first time in his career, he felt uncertain about sitting on that bench. Should I recuse myself until I get this sorted out? He asked. Diana shook her head. No, Michael, you need to face this head-on. Just remember, every person who stands before you today is someone's Gloria. He nodded slowly, gathering his robes. Before heading to the courtroom, he looked at his colleague. Thank you, Diana, for being honest with me. That's what friends do, she smiled. And Michael, this is just the beginning. Real change takes time, but it's worth it. As he walked toward his courtroom, Judge Stevens felt both terrified and determined. He knew that from this day forward, every decision he made would need to come from a place of true justice, not unconscious bias. It wouldn't be easy, but for the sake of justice, and for Gloria, he would try. 2 months after the graduation party incident, Judge Stevens found himself sitting in the back row of a community center in one of the city's predominantly black neighborhoods. The plastic chair was uncomfortable, but he barely noticed. He was too focused on listening to the stories being shared at the community meeting. My son got 3 years for having a small amount of marijuana, a mother was saying, her voice shaking. Meanwhile, my white neighbor's kid got probation for the same thing from a different judge. The judge wrote in his notebook, his hands trembling slightly. He had given similar sentences himself, never questioning the patterns until now. Gloria sat next to him, attending these meetings not just as his friend but as his guide. She had been helping him understand perspectives he'd been blind to for years. Every Thursday evening for the past 8 weeks, they met here, listening to community members share their experiences with the justice system. You're doing good work, Michael, Gloria whispered as another speaker stood up. Not many judges would come here to listen. He shook his head. I should have done this years ago. 20 years on the bench, and I never once attended a community meeting in this neighborhood. A young man took the microphone next. He looked about Emma's age, wearing a college sweatshirt. I got pulled over 3 times last month, just driving to my night classes. Each time, the officer said I looked suspicious. Each time, I had to prove I belonged in my own neighborhood. Judge Stevens remembered how he'd never had to warn Emma about such things. She drove wherever she wanted, whenever she wanted, without fear. The contrast made his heart heavy. During the break, people gathered around tables with coffee and cookies. At first, they had been suspicious of having a judge present. But week after week, as they saw him listening, taking notes, asking questions, and most importantly, making changes in his courtroom, they began to trust him. Judge Stevens called Mrs. Thompson, a community elder. Would you like to share your thoughts tonight? He stood up nervously, facing the room of about 50 people. These weren't defendants now. They were neighbors, parents, students, workers. Real people with real stories. I've been a judge for 20 years, he began, his voice quiet but clear. And for 20 years, I thought I was being fair, but I wasn't seeing the whole picture. I wasn't seeing you. The room fell silent, listening. 2 months ago, I fined a black woman harshly in my courtroom, only to discover later that she was my daughter's godmother, someone I'd known and loved for 20 years. He looked at Gloria, who nodded encouragingly. That moment forced me to face my own biases. Since then, I've been reviewing my past decisions, taking implicit bias training, and most importantly, coming here to listen to your stories. A young woman raised her hand. Have you changed anything in your courtroom? Judge Stevens nodded. Yes, I now require all sentencing recommendations to be presented without racial or gender information first. I've started a program where public defenders get more time to present their cases, and I've begun asking more questions about circumstances before making decisions. That's good, the young woman said, but is it enough? No, he admitted honestly. It's not enough, but it's a start, and I'm here because I want to learn how to do better. After the meeting, as they walked to their cars, Gloria touched his arm. You've come a long way, Michael. He looked at his friend, really looked at her, and said, I have so much further to go. Yes, she agreed. But you're not walking this path alone anymore. As he drove home that night, Judge Stevens thought about how different his life was from just 2 months ago. His courtroom procedures had changed. His perspectives had shifted. Even his friendship with Gloria had deepened, becoming more honest and real. The next morning, he would return to his courtroom. But now, when he looked down from his bench, he wouldn't just see defendants. He would see people, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own dignity. And maybe, just maybe, that would help him deliver true justice. 6 months after the graduation party incident, Judge Stevens' courtroom looked very different. Gone was the rushed atmosphere where defendants barely had time to speak. Instead, a new sign hung on the wall: Justice through understanding. On this particular morning, Gloria sat in the back of the courtroom, watching her friend at work. The case before him involved a young man caught shoplifting baby formula. Mr. Jackson, Judge Stevens said, his voice firm but kind, before I make any decision, I'd like to understand your situation better. Would you tell me what led to this? The young man, barely 20, spoke softly. Your Honor, I lost my job 3 months ago. My baby daughter. She needs special formula because of her allergies. It's expensive, and I couldn't. Instead of rushing to judgment, Judge Stevens listened. He noticed the man's worn shoes, his clean but threadbare shirt, the way he kept his back straight despite his shame. Have you sought assistance from any community programs? The judge asked. I tried, sir, but the waiting lists are long. Judge Stevens looked at his court clerk. Ms. Martinez, please provide Mr. Jackson with the resource packet we developed last month. He turned back to the young father. Inside, you'll find information about our new emergency assistance program. It's a partnership between the court and local community organizations. This was one of the changes Gloria had helped him implement. Together, they had created a program connecting the court system with community resources, helping people before they became desperate enough to break the law. Mr. Jackson, shoplifting is still a crime, Judge Stevens continued. However, I'm going to sentence you to community service at our local food bank. They'd also have a program that can help with your daughter's formula. Will you accept this alternative sentence? The young man's eyes filled with tears. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. After the morning session, Gloria met Judge Stevens in his chambers. That was good work with Mr. Jackson, she said. He smiled tiredly. I kept thinking about what you told me, about Marcus and his inhaler, about understanding people's circumstances. On his desk sat a new photo frame. Inside was a picture from Emma's graduation party, showing him with Gloria, Sarah, and Emma. Next to it was a list of community organizations they now partnered with. The program is making a difference, Gloria said, picking up a report. Repeat offenses are down 30% since we started offering resources instead of just punishments. But we need to do more, Judge Stevens replied. He pulled out a proposal he'd been working on. I want to start a mentorship program, connecting first-time offenders with community leaders who can guide them. Gloria read through the proposal. This could work, especially for young people who need support more than punishment. Will you help me run it? He asked. You understand both sides now, the system and the community. Plus, you're the reason I learned to see things differently. Before Gloria could answer, there was a knock at the door. Judge Robinson entered, carrying statistics from the past 6 months. "Your numbers have changed dramatically, Michael," she said, showing them the data. "More alternative sentences, more referrals to support services, and better outcomes overall." "It's not just about the numbers," Judge Stevens said. "It's about the lives behind them. Every person who comes into my courtroom now gets what I didn't give Gloria that day, the chance to be seen and heard." Gloria touched the proposal on his desk. "About the mentorship program. Yes, I'll help. But on one condition." "What's that?" "We name it after Marcus," she said softly. "The boy with the inhaler. To remind everyone that behind every case is a real story." Judge Stevens nodded, emotion making his voice rough. "The Marcus Project. Perfect." As they began planning the details, Judge Stevens looked at the photo on his desk again. The man in that picture had thought he knew what justice meant. But real justice, he now understood, wasn't just about following laws. It was about seeing people's humanity, understanding their struggles, and helping them find a better path forward. "You know," Gloria said, watching him, "sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments of truth." He thought about that morning in court, about the young father who would now get help instead of punishment, about all the lives they could touch through their new programs. "Thank you, Gloria," he said simply, "for not giving up on me." 1 year after the graduation party incident, Judge Stevens' courtroom buzzed with activity. It was a special day. Emma was home from her first year of college to attend the launch of the Marcus Project's new youth center. The same room that had once seen so many harsh judgments was now filled with hope. Emma sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Next to her, Sarah held the camera, ready to capture the moment. Community members, lawyers, and other judges filled the benches, including Judge Robinson, who smiled knowingly at her changed colleague. Gloria stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. 1 year ago, something happened in this very courtroom that could have driven people apart. Instead, it brought us together and created change. Judge Stevens, sitting in his usual place but without his robes today, caught her eye. They both remembered that morning, and not recognizing her, the harsh fine, the confrontation at Emma's party. Now it felt like a lifetime ago. "The Marcus Project has already helped 50 young people find mentors," Gloria continued. "We've connected hundreds of families with resources they desperately needed. And it all started because one judge learned to see beyond his bench." In the audience sat Marcus himself, now 14, with his mother. The inhaler incident that had started everything had led to his family getting help through their new programs. He was now part of their youth leadership team. Judge Stevens stood to speak next. As he approached the podium, he remembered how differently he had carried himself a year ago, so certain of his own righteousness, so blind to his biases. "When I first became a judge," he began, "I thought justice meant treating everyone the same, but I've learned that true justice means seeing everyone's humanity. It means understanding that each person who stands before us has a story." He gestured to a large screen behind him, where photos showed their program in action: mentorship meetings, community service projects, resource fairs, and training sessions for other judges. "This past year has taught me more than my previous 20 years on the bench," he continued. "And it started when I failed to recognize someone I loved as family. That failure opened my eyes to how many others I had failed to truly see." Emma wiped tears from her eyes as her father spoke. She remembered how angry she'd been that graduation night. Now, she was proud of how he had transformed that mistake into something positive. "Today, we're not just opening a youth center," Judge Stevens said. "We're opening our hearts and minds to a new way of thinking about justice. Every person who comes through these doors will find not just judgment, but understanding. Not just punishment, but opportunity." After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, a young woman approached Judge Stevens. She looked nervous. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "you sentenced my brother last year. Before all this changed, he got 5 years for something that would probably get probation and support services now." The judge felt the familiar ache of past mistakes. "What's your brother's name?" "James Williams." "Please," he said, "let's go to my office and talk about his case." Gloria watched them walk away, remembering how different this same scene would have been a year ago. Back then, the judge might have dismissed such a request. Now, he would listen, understand, and look for ways to help. "He's really changed, hasn't he?" Emma said, coming to stand beside her godmother. Gloria nodded. Your father turned a moment of shame into a lifetime of change. That's real transformation. Sarah joined them, looking at the photos on display. Who would have thought that one traffic ticket could lead to all this? Sometimes, Gloria replied, we need to see ourselves clearly before we can see others. Your father learned that lesson, and now he's teaching it to others. As the celebration continued, Judge Stevens returned from his office, the young woman now smiling hopefully. He caught Gloria's eye across the room and nodded slightly. They both knew their work wasn't finished. There would always be more stories to hear, more lives to touch, more changes to make. But they had started something important. Something that would outlast them, something that proved that real change was possible, even in the most traditional institutions, if people were willing to open their hearts and truly see each other. And it all began with one judge, one fine, and one godmother who refused to let him look away from the truth.